Right, welcome everybody. Apologies, I am losing my voice, so we shall see how it goes. Now, if you are watching this video after having watched the atavistic form video or the atavism video, I think we can agree that atavism is a pretty poor, unscientific, racist explanation of offending. Genetics, we're going to get a lot more scientific. We're going to get a lot more modern and not talk about friggin' whether you have glittering eyes and that means you're a rapist or a thief or whatever. We're going to be a lot more scientific and a lot less scientifically racist this time round. So, irregardless of what topics you take, you will have done genetic explanations before. You know I'm going to talk about candidate genes, but what specific candidate genes am I going to be talking about for offending? You know I'm not going to say 100% concordance, because genetics is always a partial explanation, a foundation, a predisposition. It is not the whole explanation. There has to be some other factors, probably environmental, in play here. And you, like I say, you know I'm going to talk about specific candidate genes and specific pieces of research. So with genetic explanations, statistics are always quite important. So I've got a few here. I'm going to be going through these individually. These are 3 of the 4 I would suggest you know. Lange is a Lange. Lange is a twin study. I've got Crowe, which is an adoption study, but also Mednick, which is an adoption study as well. You can choose between 1 or 2 of those. And you've also got Tiihonen, which is a genetic sort of genome analysis type of research. All of them have got statistics or quantitative data. I would suggest you know minimally 2 of them going into the exam. Minimally 2 of these pieces of research. I would say Tiihonen kind of has to be one of them, but your funeral. So Lange, whatever your name is, 1930. So early piece of research, right? At this point, it's not really known about genetics or DNA, certainly not. But what Lange finds is that there is concordance, agreement, consistency between if one twin gets imprisoned and the chances of the identical or non-identical twin getting imprisoned. So basically what they find is where identical twins are concerned, 12 out of 13 were concordance. So basically if one twin was in prison, the other twin was in prison. And that is, I think, that's 77%. Now, that by itself is not enough, because you need to compare the MZ twin statistic to the DZ twin statistic. That's quite important, by the way. If you are saying, oh, 2 identical twins, loads of identical twins got imprisoned, that could be genetics, or it could be where they grew up. They might have a low socioeconomic status, for example. So you have to compare the MZ statistic, which in this case was 77%, to the DZ statistic, which I think was 12%. It was 12%. 2 out of 17 was 12%. Now, that is a 65 percentage point difference. Is 100% of that difference caused by genetics? No, there will be environmental factors, so you can't say the difference is solely down to genetics, but genetics is surely part of it. Surely part of it. So Lange is an early piece of research that is fairly basic, you know. There's no genes identified or DNA or anything like that. There's no genome analysis. It's far too early for this in 1930. But there's fairly good indicators that this may be at least partially genetic. But what we really need to do is adopt some kids. It's a weird thing to say with no context. What you really need to do is adopt some kids away from criminal parents and see if they then go on to develop criminality outside of that toxic, offending, pro-criminal household. And this is where Crowe comes in. Again, still no DNA, still no genetics at this point. So Crowe believed actually twin studies are useful, but they only go part of the way. We really need to take these kids from their criminal parents to see if they then grow up and, you know, their DNA, they never knew their parents, possibly, or they weren't as impacted by them, to see if this kid grows up and becomes a criminal. So the key finding here, I think, is quite stark, really, in terms of statistics. Those children that were adopted from a criminal biological mother, that alone is pretty weird, I think. Why are we so focused on the mother being the criminal? The kid gets almost 50% of its genes from the father, who statistically, by the way, is more likely going to be a criminal. 96% of the people in prison are males in the UK. But anyway, whatever. That is a slight criticism, I guess. Socially sensitive, not really focused on the father, whatever. But the key finding here was that adopted children from a criminal biological mother were 50% likely going to have a criminal record by the age of 18 compared to kids that were adopted from a non-criminal mother, which was only 5%. That is bad. That is very different, by the way. So for those who do schizophrenia, this is pretty much the same finding of Tiihonen in terms of when he did this with schizophrenia. There's one problem here, though. There's one problem. Yes, look. Chances are, again, there is something genetic going on here. But one thing you need to know about these adoption studies is, unlike kids of schizophrenic individuals who have kids who are adopted very quickly after being born, a lot of these kids that they're talking about criminality didn't get adopted till they were like 6, 7, 8 years old. I've just realised I've said 6, 7, for fuck's sake. Until they were 7 or 8 years old. They weren't adopted till they were 7 or 8 years old. By which point the parent has had a lot of influence over them. So there's a bit, that would be an evaluation. An evaluation of adoption studies in general is that a lot of kids are not adopted from a pro-criminal family until they're quite older, maybe when the parent's gone to prison when they're sort of 7, 8, 9, 10, by which point the parent may have had quite a bad influence on them. And this is where, excuse me, Mednick's quite a good piece of research. So 1984, large-scale, comprehensive study of 14,500 people, adopted children in Denmark. How they do it is they check criminal records. So it's not like they're tracking 14,000 people. They are just doing research without ever actually talking to these children. Now, excuse me, what they found was that there was a pretty high rate of criminality, about 20%, in adopted children whose biological parents had a criminal record, but their adopted parents didn't. So you adopt a kid, mum and dad are criminals, 20% of those are going to end up being criminals, which is quite high and a lot higher than the normal rate of criminality. The highest rate was where biological and adoptive parents both had criminal records. The rate goes up to 24.5%. The lowest was where neither parents had a criminal record. That was 13.5%. So again, there is something genetic here. It's not the whole thing. Environment probably will clearly play a part. but as a genetic explanation, it is a very valid, credible, partial explanation for criminality, which likely is so complex anyway that it doesn't have one cause. So, particularly good. And then you have the more recent piece of research, only sort of 11 and a half, 12 years old. Tiihonen. Now, I remember this piece of research coming out, especially the MAOA. Scandinavian again, 900 Finnish offenders, and they revealed, and by this point, by the way, we know about genetics, we know about DNA, and there's 2 candidate genes that do seem to have an increase in people's criminal activities. Now, does the gene make them criminal? No. Like, it might make them more aggressive, and that's the criminal act. I don't know if I'm going to get this point across in a video like this without explaining it in too much detail, but it's not a criminal. It might not be a criminal gene. It might be an aggressive gene, and it's the aggression that gives you the criminal record. That might not make any sense, but with Tiihonen, there's 2 candidate genes you need to talk about. Monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA gene, monoamine oxidase A. What that basically does, if you have a normal amount of it, the gene essentially, if you've got a working gene, a working MAOA gene, that provides instructions to make an enzyme, which breaks down mainly serotonin, but it does do a few other things as well. Now, the idea being that if you have a faulty gene or a variation of the gene, it doesn't allow for as much of that enzyme to be made. Now, serotonin, imagine you've woken up, let me explain it this way. Imagine you've woken up in a naturally good mood. You're in a very good mood. There's no reason for it. You don't won the lottery or anything, or managed to persuade anybody down into the dark depths of a relationship with you. You're just in a good mood. At some point, that mood's going to go, and it might be that your brain sort of creates more of this enzyme, breaks serotonin down, and your mood naturally comes down to your normal level. The idea with the MAOA gene is that people have a variation, which means they don't produce enough of the enzyme. If you don't produce enough of the enzyme, that level is going to climb. And I always get students say the same thing here. Surely if you don't break down serotonin and it just gets higher, we know high serotonin leads to a good mood. So surely you'll just be in a good mood, not at these high levels. If you've got high serotonin, yes, you're in a good mood. If you go higher and your brain becomes saturated with this neurotransmitter, you will become very aggressive. So there's a case, I may get some of the details wrong, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, it's Rain or something, I can't remember, but there's a case in the Netherlands of 3 Dutch brothers who have a faulty MAOA gene, and they assaulted their sister, I believe it was, and they all got arrested and found that they had this genetic variation. I want to think about this. Is it your fault if you have this gene? No, you can't control what genes you have. You can't control what genes are expressed. So should we be imprisoning these offenders? Psychology will go on the argument that the offenders had no free will. They did not choose to do this crime. It has been dictated by them by biological means outside of their control, and thus the crime was not a voluntary act. Now, the legal system is obsessed by a crime having to be a voluntary act. They have chosen to do that crime. They've murdered that person. They've sexually assaulted that person. They've chosen to do it. They should go away. Psychology has a different argument here, and what you might need to write about here as an evaluation this theory risks putting psychology at odds with law, because psychology is saying we probably shouldn't be imprisoning these people who have not chosen to do these crimes, and law gets on their high horse about this. So, good evaluation. Now, the other gene, I mentioned there were two genes. The other gene is the CDH13 gene. Now, it's fair to say this is not a criminal gene. This gene is a really big risk factor for some neurodevelopmental psychotic disorders, like it says there, substance abuse, ADHD. A better argument here is that the CDH13 gene gives you conditions like ADHD which make you more vulnerable to criminal activity. Substance abuse, for example, we don't all feel the same substance if we eat a tube of Parma Violets or smoke a cigarette or shoot up heroin, one assumes. So the point being here that if you have a variant of this gene, and again we all have this gene, but if you have a particular variant of this gene, it is going to lead to behaviours that will likely make you an offender. So does the gene make you an offender? No. The gene makes you potentially have ADHD or feel substances much more intensely, leading you to substance abuse, leading you to offending. But it is a good explanation. Like I said at the top of this video, I guess one way to say is that there is no gene for offending. There is a gene that gives you certain behaviours that make you more likely to be an offender, but there's no offender gene. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if it's translating across. Now, voice is starting to go, bear with me. It's a debate whether this should be in the genetic explanation, I guess. And those of you who do schizophrenia, which will be a lot of you, will be familiar with the Diathesis-Stress Model, but this is another opportunity for me to go through it, so I will. A better argument here, and I've said the whole time, haven't I, that it clearly isn't entirely genetic. I mean, that's a ridiculous argument. Oh, I've almost snapped my hand off the chair. That's a ridiculous argument to say that it's entirely genetic. So what a better explanation is that having certain genes, excuse me, having certain genes is going to lead you to have a vulnerability that if you have a bit of a difficult environment, like a childhood or an abusive parent or a pro-family, a pro-criminal family, that will be the trigger that triggers off these biological vulnerabilities. So yes, you may have a gene that makes you incredibly angry, but if you don't have the environment that triggers off that poor emotional management, then you're not going to be a criminal. So basically, the graph kind of shows it all, to be honest, right? If you have a high diathesis, you've got the CDH13 variant, you've got the MAOA variant, you're pretty buggered, I'm not going to lie. All it takes is a little environmental stress. Maybe a criminal dad, who's in prison or whatever, or maybe you have a brother who is not particularly moral or whatever, right? Whereas if you are born without those genes, it's going to take a hell of a lot, or without that biological predisposition, it's going to take a hell of a lot of stress for you to trigger off that diathesis. As a theory, great theory, right? Great theory. I'm not going to go beyond that. It's just a combination. This theory, more holistic. It gives us a semblance of control, because we can control our environment a lot better than we can control our genes. You've got pro-criminal family, right? Emancipate yourself, right? Leave the family home. Go live your nan, who's never committed a crime in her life. So, yeah, I mean, there's pretty good explanation, to be honest. Now, evaluating this, I'm going to go through. I've got 5 evaluations. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. The first one is the obvious one. And I'm going to go through these. I'm not going to read them out because I'm sure you can read. But the obvious issue here, it's impossible to separate out truly genes from the environment. And Crowe's I'll come to this in a second. So a good point. You've got evidence, you've got elaboration, and then an obvious link back there as well. The second one is research support, which you could bring in Mednick, Sarnoff Mednick, great name. So particularly good piece of research. What this does, and look, the point actually is up there. It supports both the genetic explanation, but also it better supports the diathesis-stress explanation. So what we just covered a second ago. Obviously, this is biologically deterministic, right? You are saying that these people do not have a choice. Now, how would you elaborate? Well, therefore, it's socially sensitive. By expressly saying that criminals do not have a choice in their crime and that prison is destiny, great quote there, Kieran Shipley, but by stating that prison is your destiny is pretty offensive. It's fairly offensive, I think. So you could come at this from a limitation point of view. Also, reductionist. Now, if we're saying it's genetic, that ignores schooling. I went to a school in the, let's just say, inner city Southampton, and it was like being in the hood. It was like a criminal jungle. I don't know how I survived without a criminal record, to be honest. I don't know how I got out of that place without a criminal record. I mean, I saw one lad who shall not be named, although his name is Omar. I saw one lad come in just holding a grand. Just holding a grand that he got from drug dealing. He just had it in his pocket. Nobody asked him to pull it out, by the way. He just pulled it out. And we're like, what the? Why you got a grand, Omar? I shouldn't have named him, actually. He might find me. My point being is that by saying it's genetic, are we really saying that wouldn't have impacted a lot of kids to see somebody get criminal proceeds of £1,000 when you're a 13-year-old and not go, oh, okay, I need to sell some drugs. I need to sell some cocaine. It ignores socioeconomic status, right? So it's a very, very parochial is the great word here. To narrow crime down to that one gene is incredibly parochial in its perspective. It lowers the explanatory power. Not good. Nada goodo. And then finally, there is a particular issue with adoption studies, as I said, that a lot of them deal with adoption too late. The kid has been adopted. They've at 7 or 8 years old. If you're dealing with a schizophrenic mother as opposed to a criminal one, you get adopted fairly quickly because that mum is not able to look after the kid. A criminal, whilst not mugging old ladies or robbing banks, they still are theoretically able to actually look after a kid. So there's a real methodological flaw here with adoption studies in that a lot of them take place when the adoptions are old. The adoptions take place when the kids are older, basically. And that's it. Not the worst genetic explanation going, to be honest. Loads of discussion points to go. The next time we're going to be looking at neural, which is a lot harder, I think. Is a lot more technical. A bit fluffy, I think, for a scientific explanation. But that will be coming quite soon. When? Don't know. When it can be bothered. Peace out.